Welcome back to the Urban Elements Studio. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about thread choices. Not so much in the technical sense in regard to their weight or their actual fiber content, but really more about choices in matching or not matching, high contrast or low contrast, high value or low value in the type of quilting that you're doing. We see a lot of comments on our page, but also on other people's pages, about people doing machine quilting, especially when they're just starting out. And it sounds a lot like they're using a high contrast thread and they're practicing, and quite often they're practicing on an actual quilt, which is not something that I would recommend. What I like to do is just like this piece here, and maybe later you'll see on my machine, I just have loaded white fabric. I either wait until I have a coupon or something's on sale, and I will just buy plain white fabric or plain green fabric. It doesn't matter the color so much, but I wouldn't actually make time putting a quilt together. I would just go ahead and use a piece of regular fabric just so that we can start out. The minute you load an actual quilt onto your quilting frame, or you are putting it sandwiched together under your domestic machine, there's a lot of pressure there, and we strive for perfection, and that pressure of striving for perfection almost inevitably will cause us to make mistakes. It takes quite a while to get the feeling of moving the fabric or moving the machine. And another thing I think that we really take for granted is that we see really amazing quilters at shows. Jamie Wallen comes to mind, Beth Ann Nemish, but there are many quilters that I could name. And we see their work and we feel like we need to get in at that level. But both of the people that I just mentioned have been quilting for 20 or 30 years. And this is something that I think people, it's a part of quilting that they want to skip, and that's the learning curve of something. And they want to get right to the level of perfection that they see other people experiencing. And that's just something that you can't replace, is the time that you invest in something. I'm going to bring the camera in and show you a quilt that I made a long time ago. This one was made well before I had a longarm machine, and at a distance you really can't see much in the way of quilting, but I'll bring the camera in so you can see that. But in general, we have I have here a representation of three basic types of thread. These over here are 100% cotton. You can see there's a variety of colors. We have both solid and variegated options. In the center here I have monofilament. This is a superior monopoly, and a lot of the applique samples that you'll see, well, actually all of the applique samples that you'll see in our booth or on our website, every single one of these is quilted with a clear monofilament, clear monopoly from Superior. And the reason we use that is because it allows the texture of the quilting to come out, but it doesn't add any design element as far as color to overlap on the applique or in the background. So you get a beautiful texture overall of the quilt, but there is no color change as it goes over the background or any of the variety of colors of applique. So it's just something that we like to do. It's certainly not something that you have to do. I think I would also be really comfortable if we used a off-white 100% cotton or a off-white polyester or rayon thread, because it's a traditional choice and the eye kind of cancels that out. But I'm going to move the camera and we'll get talking about just some quilt samples, and just to give you some idea about how to match thread, and really when you want it to disappear and when you want it to pop. This is a quilt that I made so long ago. In fact, I had to make 4 of these quilts because my mom wanted one, her sister wanted one, my sister wanted one, and I made one for my niece. And this is actually the one I made for my niece. But you can see I was not very good at quilting. This was when I was using just a domestic machine, and I can see all the pokies from the back of the quilt. The back was blue, and so I used blue thread in the back, but I used white thread on the front. And even though the quilting isn't very good, and I'm not necessarily ashamed of it, even though it's really kind of bad, this quilt is held up for at least 20 years. In the border, you really can't even see that there's any quilting at all, and that's because I chose thread. I changed the thread color to match the color stripe that I was quilting. So the fabric is completely stabilized, but you don't see the thread. And this is often, even today, my go-to choice. When I'm choosing fabric and thread for quilting, I choose a thread color that is going to disappear as closely as possible. And the most common thought on that is that you choose the same color, which sometimes you do. In this case, it was white thread on a white fabric. But more importantly is that you choose the right value. And value is the amount of light or dark in the fabric or the thread. And so I could have chosen a different color than white, and it was, as long as it was the value of that white, it would have been very much the same. It could have been a very light lavender, a very light pink. It wouldn't have mattered. And as we progress, you'll see that value is the most important key player in choosing a thread color, either if you want that quilting design to really stand out, or if you want it to fade into the background. And I would say for any beginner, choose something that's going to fade into the background at the beginning and let yourself off the hook. When you choose high contrast thread, that is when you start feeling all the pressure of your mistakes because they're clearly evident. And so I like to use something like this that bleeds into the background. Another classic choice that I like to make is to just err on the side of tradition. And many quilts like this would have either a white or an ecru thread. And for the most part, the quilting just fades into the background. You can see it very little on the green and on the red. This was just a machine applique quilt that I made years ago, and it has one of the Urban Elements Pantos on it. I believe it is Angelica, but I'm not sure I remember, because even this quilt is at least 16 years old. It was primarily made with batiks, and you can see that the white thread is a very classic traditional choice. And when people see that, it almost as if the thread color disappears because they're so used to seeing it, so caught up in the tradition of it, that they don't even notice it anymore. And I don't know if you can see here, I must have had a thread break because this was a stiff fusible web underneath. It caused my thread to break there, but you really don't even see that when the quilt is hanging. And I didn't get this quilted until years after I made the top, so you'll see this fabric again here in a minute because I made a whole quilt out of that. This was a fabric, actually it was a fabric collection that I fell in love with. It was a Christmas fabric, and I just bought 6 yards of each of the two, the front and the back, and I just pieced them together because I thought the fabric was so beautiful I didn't really even want to try and cut it up. I think this is probably the only time I've ever done that. But you can see again, I think this is, oh gosh, I think that's hyacinth on there. But I just used an off-white isocord on that, and I quilted it. Both the isocord off-white are in the top and bobbin, and you can see that the thread really just disappears in both cases. And I use this basically as a utility quilt. It's gotten lots of wear. I can even see where some of the threads have popped from use because I use it. This is on my bed almost exclusively, summer and winter, because it's a fairly lightweight quilt. But the quilting pattern gives the quilt texture, but because I've used a low value thread, it doesn't really pop out, so it doesn't diminish away from the fabric selection that I used. This was another old quilt that I made. I actually made this when I was living in Florida, and I quilted this on my handy quilter, which is what I had at the time, and I also quilted it using one of my favorite pantos from Urban Elements, and that was called Angel Wing Begonia. And the handy quilter, I feel like, utilized the cotton thread a lot better. It seems like on my Bernina, I'm noticing that I get better results with the isocord. The cotton thread seems to really lint up the bobbin area on my Bernina. So sometimes the machine that you have is going to also play a very key role in the thread that you choose. You're going to find that some machines just like one type of thread better than another, and you get better results. And the only way you're going to find that out is by practicing. And I would recommend buying smaller spools to practice with instead of these large cones, regardless of what type it is, just to find out if your machine's even going to be friends with it. You don't want to have a bunch of thread that your machine doesn't even like. But on this quilt you can see we have lights, mediums, and darks. And what I like to do in a time like that is use something that's variegated. Now, I didn't use this color thread, obviously, but you can see there's light, medium, and dark in these variegated threads. And these particular ones here are cotton, similar to the ones that I used on this quilt. And what you're going to find is that the design fades and is more prominent in different areas of the quilt, and there's no controlling that, and I was completely happy with that. So you're going to see it pop up when it's light on the dark fabric, and you're going to see it when it's dark on the light fabric, and it's going to fade in and out. It's going to give you some pattern play, but also I can guarantee you if I made any mistakes on this panto, no one's going to see that because it blends in and out so beautifully. Only if you were really having tension problems would it be evident, but it's not going to be evident just because you didn't follow the design properly. And you can see on the front and back I used the same thread in the top and bobbin, but the back is dark primarily with some light flowers, but it's still, you know, even at 2 feet away, you wouldn't be able to see much of any mistake if you could ever find one at all. So it's really like the value that you want to look at when you're choosing a quilting thread. Here on the table you can see it's just a sandwich that I have kept. This is from when I was actually learning to do some free motion work, and you can see that's terrible. I'm really not ashamed of it either. I kept it because I like to see the progression that I've made. I do like to do some free motion quilt, but I also love the efficiency and the beauty of a panto. So there's all kinds of things that you could do to practice, but I really recommend getting just solid fabric and just a thread strong enough for you to be able to see it, and go ahead and practice either with a panto, with a design board, however it is that you're going to practice. Just use some regular fabric so that you can go ahead and get some muscle memory under your belt. I'm going to show you a couple other quilts while we're here. Here are 2 additional pieced samples, 2 finished quilts. This particular one was made by Patricia Ritter. It's a beautiful log cabin quilt, all pieced. And you can see that she chose sort of olive green, a little bit of a chartreuse green, cotton thread to quilt the panto on the quilt. It is, let's see, I can even tell you the name on this one. It's quilted with dragonflies. But you can see even Patricia didn't use something that really popped out and overtook the power of the log cabin blocks. It's just something that ties the blocks together and really does a beautiful job of adding texture to the quilt. This particular one I made, it was with some cave fabric, obviously, and again it has a simple pattern, but I don't remember the name of this panto. But I used, because there's so many colors in this, I chose a medium variegated, it's almost a rainbow color because I can see yellow, purple, green, red, blue. So this was also a cotton thread. This would have been when I had my handy quilter, and it's just a really pretty design. It gives some motion, some movement, but none of this is like really strong in your face quilting with really loud thread. So that's really one of the things I really want to keep impressing, is that we're looking at the value of the thread and we're trying to get it to blend. When you become really good at machine quilting, whether it's with a panto, ruler work, free motion work, tearaway, design boards, then you can really start choosing really bold thread choices on a more neutral background, and that's when you'll really start seeing some of these design pops. But that's not something that people start off doing. That is something people build years and years of experience to get to. So don't feel like that's where you have to start at, or that if you're seeing mistakes, it's because the pattern isn't good or there's something wrong with the design. It's just because it takes us a while to get to that level of expertise. This is a good example of one of our applique pieces. You can see the design really clearly on there. This is called malachite. This is part of our Love Bug collection of laser cut and prefused applique. But you can see that we have piecing in this quilt, as well as the laser cut applique. We also have a wide variety of values and colors. So we have the lightest light in the white, and then we even have black here in the windshield and the rear view mirrors on the Love Bug, and a lot of medium tones on the piecing. But we've still used the clear monopoly on here. It still allows you to see the quilting design really easily without obstructing or taking away from any of the piecing or the applique. So that's one of the reasons we really love the clear monopoly. Sometimes we would use smoke if we were using something really dark, but I don't think I have a sample of that. This is also another really old quilt of mine. This was from a book called Monterey Medallion, and it had also a lot of greens and reds, medium values, and so I used a variegated cotton thread that was olives and a little bit of gold. And I believe this was Queen Victoria feather that this was quilted with, which gives you a really nice even quilting over the whole quilt without a lot of blank voids in it. And the fabric and thread blend harmoniously, so it looks like a really nice project. One of the things that I don't like, I always relate quilting to perfume. And I think when you walk into a room, you should not be able to smell somebody's perfume until you come into their personal space. And I think that is true with quilting as well. In general, I want to be drawn in by the quilt pattern, and then get closer and you start seeing the fabric choices, and then you get even closer, and when you're up close and personal, then you start seeing the beautiful quilting in the room, in the project. If you can see quilting all the way across the room on a quilt, many times to me that's too strong. So that's why I like to choose the value of the thread to match the value of the fabric that I'm working with. This is another great example. because this was completely custom quilted, based exactly on the pattern here. But you can see that Rusty changed her thread colors when she changed what she was quilting. So on this cream colored background, she used cream colored matchstick style quilting. And then when she got to the flying geese, then she changed to a rainbow colored variegated thread that picked up all the colors in the rainbow that were in these flying geese units. So you don't have to quilt the whole thing in one thread color. You can certainly change thread colors, and many people will change sometimes 20 or 30 different colors of thread depending on what it is they're quilting, so that that thread continually blends into the fabric that it's quilted on, and you can only see those elements when you get up close and personal with the quilt. When you step away from the quilt, all you see is the dynamic quilt pattern itself, which was based also on the value of the lights and darks in that quilt. So this is another great example of just changing the thread color to keep the quilting in the background and the pattern in the foreground. This quilt actually never got finished being quilted. I had it on my handy quilter, and I kept having tension problems and thread breaking with the handy quilter, and so I had to take this quilt off to have my machine serviced, and for whatever reason it just never got loaded back on the machine. So I have like 1 or 2 rows at the bottom that still need to be quilted. But you can see on this that I used a much more highly contrasted thread on the quilt. It is a cotton variegated thread, and I used a rainbow color again because there's so many colors in the quilt top, but you could really see how the quilting is popping out a lot more on this particular quilt, and some people may like that. Again, this is Angel Wing Begonia, which is one of my favorite quilt patterns from Urban Elements, but to me this is like a little bit too strong. Now this was meant to be a novelty quilt. It would have been for a younger person, a preteen, or under 10. So it doesn't bother me so much that it's a little bit more intense than I would have wanted. But this is just a reminder for me that I like to really blend my quilting thread in as much as possible so that it doesn't pop quite this much. Again, it's going to be a matter of choice, but regardless, I would not start with this high of a contrast when you're starting quilting. I would try and choose something that allows for a little margin of error without it being a glaring error. I made this Dream Big 9-patch quilt really because I had bought so many of these Dream Big panels over and over again, but also I wanted something that was going to be large enough to go on my bed, and this quilt finished, I think it's like 96 by 96. But it was also a great opportunity for me to practice a lot of the free motion quilting things that I had seen. I made a Dream Big panel for the wall using the tearaway, and that was really great also. But I was really thrilled with the end result of this because I got to just play with dozens of different design ideas, and I think it was a huge success. I love it on my bed. It would not have been as equally great a success in my mind if the thread was really popping out in high contrast. I chose the thread colors as closely as possible. There's at least 3 or 4 thread color changes as you go from the lighter petals out to the dark. And I also did a couple colors of green in the center of each of the block. I wanted that thread to match as closely as possible, and in that way my mistakes don't show up. They just blend in. If you make a mistake over and over, it's really more of a design idea rather than error. But if this had been super high contrast, I wouldn't have been pleased. And as I look close, I can see all kinds of little mistakes that I made when I was quilting. Too heavy of backtracking, going over the lines, but none of that shows up because I chose low contrast thread. And I think that's the most important thing I could stress. I know you're probably tired of hearing it already in this video, but I just hear people all the time commenting that they quilt it and they don't like it because it's really popping out and they can see all the errors, and it usually comes down to thread choice. This is an example of one of our pantograph sets. It had blocks, border, corner elements, setting triangles, corner triangles. It also had the full-size panto. And you know, these things are really meant as a spirit guide. They're not meant to be a drill sergeant. So regardless if you're just starting out and you might have a simpler design, or you're getting into something that interlocks a little bit more, maybe a little bit more densely quilted, these things are just meant to be a guide to tell you how to create this design. If you stitch a little off of this, it doesn't mean that you have to go back and rip it out. If you choose thread color that's similar in value and color to the quilt that you're sewing, these mistakes just don't pop out. And you don't have to beat yourself up if you're not exactly on a line, if where you backtracked wasn't perfect, if there's a loop and it didn't come out exactly the way it was printed on the paper. That's fine. If it's a loop that you could create over and over, then just do that loop every time you get to that section. That's your design style. That's where we want you to be. These things are meant to guide you through a pattern, but they're not meant to punish you when you're not exactly on the line. This pantograph paper will never be visible with your quilt, so if it's not exactly on the line, that isn't a problem. Just go ahead and keep sewing. The only time I would rip out stitching is if you were having a tension problem where you were getting looping or eyelashes, and that's something completely different. That has more to do with the setup of the machine than it does about thread choice. When it comes to thread choice and you make a little mistake, you don't go over something exactly right, we think that's perfectly fine. That just shows the progression as in your work as time goes on, and we all will get better as we go through this together. We don't expect anyone to be a master quilter in the first 6 months of learning a new hobby. I want to thank you for popping in today and listen to me go on and on about the value of thread in regard to choosing a quilting pattern and the style. I just really think it's important for people to not put so much pressure on themselves with choosing a really high contrast thread color. I know there are people out there that are winning awards with really amazing machine quilting that really pops off of the fabric. In many cases, they're whole cloth quilts where there's absolutely no piecing and the quilting is the whole design element. And in those cases, I understand that really high contrast thread. But for most quilting, I think the quilt pattern should be the first thing we see, and then our fabric choices, and then when we get closer, the thread choice that we used. And I hope that takes some of the pressure off of some of the beginning quilters. Don't think that you have to perform at these high levels. It has taken me, I've been machine quilting for at least 25 years. I've been quilting for longer than that. But I've only started recently doing any free motion work. But I still love pantos. I still love the design boards and some ruler work. They're all just different tools in my toolkit. But thanks for stopping by today. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. And if you have any comments about this video or other videos that you'd like to see, go ahead and leave comments on our comment section. Thank you. But wait, there's more. Come on in and I'll show you a couple tips. I almost forgot to tell you these little tips to go along with your thread lesson today. Almost all of the good thread companies will have pages that you can download. This particular one is from Superior Threads, and this one has longarm machine thread reference guide. Well, this could also be used for your domestic machine, but with the longarm machine it tells you the weight of the thread and also the weight of the needle that's recommended for that weight of thread. This could help educate you on the different weights of thread, what the description of the thread is or what they're made out of, and what size needle you should be using for your machine. This is very helpful information. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of knowing which needle to use. That's like huge. So this particular one you can download from Superior Threads, but you could look at different thread manufacturers' website and see what they have to offer. Another really great thing is to go ahead and invest in some thread charts. This particular one, again by Superior Thread, can be purchased from them, and there isn't a fee for these because they do cost the company something to make. This particular one actually has the thread wound around the cardboard so that you can actually see what the actual thread would look like. This particular one is from Isacord, and I don't know if you can tell, but I have checked off all of the colors that I actually have. And again, this is something that you could purchase sometimes from your local quilt shop, but certainly from the thread manufacturer themselves. And whether this is $2 or $7 or $12, it doesn't seem very exciting, but these are invaluable when you get to trying to pick out thread, because the color represented here is much more accurate than it would be on your computer screen. So this is a huge bonus when picking out fabric for a quilt. And this is my last little thought on thread. If you're trying to pick out thread and you're not sure which one to use, what I like to do sometimes is just unspool some on the quilt just to see what it looks like. Here is a white thread, and you can see that's fairly high contrast. This is a little bit of a peaky peach, and this would start to blend in a little bit, but then you have this kind of a crabapple color, and you can see, you can't even see where I'm unspooling that on the quilt. And this is probably exactly what I used on here, and this would still give you a lot of texture on your quilt as you were quilting it, but it's not going to pop out those mistakes. So you can see it's light, sort of a very light medium, and this is probably a pretty well set medium. I could get much darker with a very dark burgundy or black, but that's just a great way to test fabric, and as you step away from it, to see how far away you can get before that thread disappears. For me, this one's disappearing right up close, but it still shows how beautiful the quilting is. So that's your homework I want you to do, is to go and look at some of the beautiful quilting that you've seen on other people's quilts and see how well they've blended the thread to the fabric, or if it's really high contrast. But when you see those high contrast, I want you to investigate a little bit and find out how long that person's been quilting, because we don't ever want to undervalue the experience that somebody has in making a quilt. I've often heard people say or ask, how long does it take to make a quilt? And an experienced quilter will say that it only took 6 months to make this quilt, but it took me a lifetime to learn how to make this quilt. So I want to leave you with that little snippet of inspiration. Don't get discouraged, and don't think you have to jump in at the pro level when you're quilting. Just choose a lower contrast thread that's not going to amplify all your mistakes. Thanks again for joining us, and I'll see you soon.